Okay, we have a couple of people joined us. So hello everyone, welcome to the 7th webinar as part of the ISDM Knowledge Series. Today we have Ms. Aparajita Agarwal with us, who would be speaking about the sources of funding for the social sector. Aparajita currently advises entrepreneurs and impact investors in an independent capacity. In a career spanning 16 plus years, she has built expertise in creating knowledge products and designing large-scale interventions to address challenges of social enterprise, development, and social equity. She has previously worked with British Asian Trust as its country director for India and supported the creation of one of the largest development impact bond in primary education. From 2004 until 2016, she worked at IntelCap as a founding team member and led Sankalp Forum, a global platform for social entrepreneurship and impact investing. She started her career at Care India. Thank you, Aparajita, for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here and I'm a bit nervous doing this webinar for the first time, but thank you again to ISDM and the team there for this opportunity. Should I just go with a quick introduction on the presentation itself? All right. So I'm going to be talking about the future of funding for the social sector. And a lot of this is coming from my own experience in the space of having worked for about 16 years in the development sector. What I've done is created an outline on a PowerPoint so that I can share and toggle that on the screen. We can look at that, and if you have questions, I believe you can post them through the webinar, and we can address them towards the end of the webinar in the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar. So I'll go right ahead and share my screen. Just give me a moment. I think this should give, I believe the screen should now be visible. So to provide a quick overview of what I'll be covering today, we'll talk about the funding landscape of the social sector in India. We're going to move to talk about what are our reasons to be optimistic, how does that landscape look like. I'll talk a bit about the need for developing an environment that encourages social funding and investments. I will then go on to talking about how one can look at unlocking funding from new and traditional sources, as well as the need for greater innovations in funding mechanisms. And we'll end with looking into the future just a little bit, and hopefully followed by questions from all of you. Okay. I guess you can all see this first slide on the funding landscape. This is coming from a report from the Skoll Center that released about 10 years ago. But I'm going to talk a bit about this, use this as a background to talk about the background of the funding landscape in India. And the context will largely be India in this case, because my understanding is that most of the participants that we have on the webinar are from India. So, I mean, just to set the context, I believe most of us on this webinar are people who are working in the social enterprise or social development space. A large part of my background comes from the social investment and social entrepreneurship space, which again has been a mix of both for-profit and non-profit sector. Now, so the sources of social investment can roughly be grouped into these three primary types, the public sector, private sector, and the third sector, or what we call as the social sector as well. There are clearly significant areas of overlap between these three sources of social investments, and they result in a number of emerging hybrid forms of funding. There has been a huge amount of innovation and social entrepreneurship related interventions that we've seen coming up lately, especially in this past decade. There are newer funding strategies that are being developed. As we speak, every year we come to know of a few new jargons, of a few new innovative mechanisms that are coming up to support nonprofits, social enterprises, startups as well as growth stage companies that are still trying to break ground into new markets. And quite a few of them are also now increasingly focusing towards building social and corporate partnerships. My understanding is that this funding for social enterprises has undergone some significant transformations, especially in these past 20 years. And I think a watershed moment was the global economic crisis of 2008. We've seen that in these past 10 years, there's been a significant change in how investors, mainstream investors, have tried to find alternative approaches towards money management. And a lot of disenchantment owing to crisis, or owing to the financial crisis and the global economic crisis of 2008, has led to people actually looking at more innovative mechanisms and a much more diversified way of investing money, not just in the traditional markets and money markets, but also looking at areas like social investments, bonds, debt funds, and so on, that can actually do good as well, while in some cases making money, or in other cases, it could be a case of just diversifying the way an investor looks at his portfolio, at his or her portfolio of investments. One of the things that happened in 2008 after the global financial crisis was that the traditional sources of funding that we saw for the social sector underwent a huge change. There was a huge reversal of the long-term macro trends. They saw that there was a significant advancement in one, the amount of capital that was attracted by the social sector, and second, the kind of sources that were providing those capital. So whereas first you saw initially, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, where you saw primarily government or large foundations alone doing grant making, in these past 10 years, you would actually see that there are actually not just smaller family offices coming up, there are private foundations, there are CSR entities, there are a huge number of hybrid organizations that are starting to actually do grant making as well. And this trend exists not just in the grant making segment, but also in the investment segment, where we initially saw a huge uptake or money coming in the form of private equity in mainstream companies. But if you see the way the sector has evolved in the last 10 years or so, we have seen emergence of a huge number of funds, not just big funds, but smaller startup funds, growth stage funds that have started to actually support startups, support growth stage companies, and support even nonprofit ventures. So I think there are a significant number of opportunities that one could look at when it comes to social sector. It is obviously a very important sector for India's economy. It includes several important components such as education, health, medical care, water supply, sanitation, poverty alleviation, housing conditions, etc. And all of these play a very vital contribution in the human development. In our context, especially in the context of India, we also refer to the social sector as the value system of the economy that fosters values such as philanthropy, social business, social entrepreneurship, etc. If you notice, most of the important aspects of human development are now governed within economic sphere. So be it investments in health or education or climate change or agri, a lot of these have started now falling under the purview of not just the economic sphere, but also private philanthropy is playing a vital role in these fields. Now, one of the big changes we've seen in India was the new CSR rule that got passed in 2014 that has brought a sharp focus on the social participation and accountability of corporates. And again, the private sector is not left behind either. We've seen several well-known impact funds and venture philanthropy funds that have emerged and have shown interest in this unique and emerging business opportunity that balances investor returns with social responsibilities and aims to uplift communities. Now, I'm going to take you to two more slides after this, which gives you a bit of estimate of what the market size looks like. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of trouble toggling here. Let's go with this. This should be visible to you now. This is coming from a Bain report that came out in 2017, an annual yearly report that they bring out, where they talk about the funds that have been raised for the social sector in India. This talks about the period from 2011 until 2016. And if you'll see, a huge amount of this is actually coming from public funding, which is the spend that the government makes on public funding allocations. But increasingly, beyond the foreign sources, which used to be the traditional sources of funding for the development sector, there are now domestic corporations and individual philanthropists that are coming in as well. And if you see between 2011 to 2016, you see a significant growth in not so much in the public funding, but a significant growth in where the private sector is coming in, the domestic corporations, as well as the individual philanthropists that are actually putting in money. Move on to the next slide, which is about the impact investing space, which again is a very integral part of the social development space, but from a for-profit lens. This slide draws numbers from a McKinsey analysis that came out last year, which talks about impact investing in India having reached a $5.2 billion mark between 2010 to 2016, and an average deal size of $17.6 million. Now, again, there are caveats here. A large part of this has gone into the financial services segment, specifically microfinance. And 2012 onwards, we've also seen a lot of investments going into health, education, agri ventures, and so on. But I think what's heartening to see is that this average investment size is growing, and it's not just the traditional foreign sources of money that used to come a few years back, but the funding landscape is fast changing to actually include a number of debt funds, equity funds, smaller family offices and foundations that are putting together impact investing funds within India itself to actually support the growth of the sector. I'll focus a bit more on what I believe are the 5 big opportunities for us to look at within the sector. I'll freeze this here. So I talk about these 5 big opportunities. The first, I believe, is the growing interest among capital providers. I mentioned this earlier in my talk, that one of the direct impacts of the global financial crisis in 2008 was that there was an increased interest to find alternate venues or alternate ways of managing money and investing. A direct outflow from that was actually money, or both philanthropic and non-philanthropic, coming into social sector. We've seen that there has been a growing interest among capital providers to look at the social sector from 2 perspectives. One, in terms of how they can actually support ventures that are doing good, that are breaking new grounds, that are in newer markets, but also on the other hand to support commercially viable or highly scalable ventures. And that I think is a really good trend that we've seen actually only gaining pace in the last few years. The second big sort of area or an opportunity is the widespread recognition that the sector needs to create viable solutions to social and environmental challenges. We've seen that in the past decade, there has been an emergence of a new cadre of investors or funders. What earlier used to be the big corporations or the big philanthropists has now given way to this entire sort of community of, I would say, ultra high net worth individuals, millennials who have actually money to spare, or who are keen to actually invest and fund the social landscape, because they believe that even with their little contributions, they can support the creation of viable solutions and scalable solutions that can change the traditional ways of tackling social and environmental issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about this here. I think there used to be a myth about commercial money only coming to support the commercial sort of enterprise sector, and only philanthropic money coming in to support the social or the nonprofit sector. And what we've seen actually is an emergence of hybrids. By hybrids, I mean the people, for example, there is grants that now support for-profit enterprises. And on the other hand, there are commercial investors who are willing to actually invest into nonprofit models as well, or who are willing to fund into nonprofit models as well. And that, I believe, is quite interesting as a sector to actually see that there are no rigid boundaries that are defining how funding needs to happen in the social sector. I think the other way that the social sector has benefited in a big way has been the growth of impact investments, and how the conventional models of philanthropy and investing has actually led many more people to look at investing into what they believe is into what can potentially be for impact with sufficient scale and flexibility. In countries like India, that means that we have seen a movement to give and invest money into supporting initiatives that focus on providing products and services to the poor or the underserved, and in general, and very specifically to vulnerable segments. What we're also seeing is that more and more consumers are incorporating values-driven consideration into their purchasing and investment decision, which again means that HNIs or even the working class in a lot of cases is starting to actually set aside a portion of their income or a portion of their savings towards looking at crowdfunding models, towards looking at impact investing or angel investing as a way to support social entrepreneurs. And these could, again, the interest here is both into for-profit and non-profit model. Now, the third big opportunity is that we've seen early successes happen, and this has helped in establishing a track record and hence helped in attracting more capital. Now, this means that there is a potential every time an experiment goes successful. There is a potential to actually involve more people to actually come and invest. In my a few years of working in the innovative financial sector, one of the very encouraging pieces of work that we saw, or where we saw an uptrend, was in the impact bond space, where impact bonds were, and they are, I believe, still highly experimental, still in a very nascent stage of development. But what we've seen is that the few that have been actually live and have created positive, solid results on ground has led to there being a much widespread discussion around how not just a traditional philanthropist or a large foundation can get involved in supporting an impact bond, but even individuals could potentially rally around to, or angel investors and angel funders could actually rally around to supporting something like an impact bond. And that is quite interesting, because that means that every successful experiment is, or every successful initiative is leading to establishing a new way of potentially funding the social sector. The fourth bit that I wanted to talk about was the influx of talent. This again has been very peculiar. I believe in the last 15 years, we've actually seen a reversal of what we otherwise used to call brain drain, right? Where you would see more and more qualified, good quality, talent from India or from developing countries like India moving abroad, moving to developed countries and working there. I would say one of the direct benefits of the global financial crisis was that we actually saw people getting disenchanted with the mainstream markets, or what was happening in the mainstream markets in the developed country, and we actually saw a greater influx of talent moving towards social issues, towards developing countries. I have observed trends where we've seen Ivy League educated people come back, start their own enterprise or set up their own nonprofit. And quite a few of them 10 years hence are extremely successful and are doing some groundbreaking work in sectors like education, microfinance, health, agriculture, and so on. And this influx of talent has also resulted in a direct attraction to bringing in more capital into the space, because with good talent comes the trust that you could potentially invest and fund a sector that is otherwise still reasonably nascent in the country. The fifth big opportunity that I see and I would like to highlight here is the new and emerging sources of funding for social initiatives. And this is again slightly different from slightly different from the venture capital and the PE and the traditional grant making that's already happening. What we are actually seeing is an entire new class of financial products, both for nonprofit and the for-profit space in the social sector. We are seeing creative entrepreneurs that are using models such as crowdfunding, that are actually leveraging their existing projects, that are using matched funding, that are using creative partnerships with the corporate sector and the banking and financial services sector to actually find new sources of funding for social initiatives. And I think all these reasons are extremely interesting and are going to pave the way the funding for the landscape is going to look like, funding for the social sector is going to look like in the next few years. Moving on to my next slide. Sorry. Moving on from the 5 big opportunities that I talked about, I think there is a huge need to develop an environment that encourages social funding and investments. And what we are seeing, as while we are seeing an influx of capital coming in and an emergence of domestic philanthropy and investors looking at the social sector quite seriously, we are also seeing an interest in developing an environment that could encourage social funding and investments in a much bigger way than what we are seeing right now. And now there are 4 points that I think are greatly important to ensure that this happens, that the environment becomes more and more friendly for the social initiatives that are emerging now or are in growth stages now. The first of them is the metrics bit. The need for more rigorous metrics and greater transparency. What I want to sort of focus here is the fact that there are quite a few metrics, both in the nonprofit and the for-profit space, where we see ways to measure impact. What we unfortunately don't see still is a common understanding from the funders to actually collaborate and actually have the metrics, have different kind of metrics speak to each other. What we also don't see is the sharing of impact data across the sector, especially when you have new enterprises or new initiatives coming up. How can they potentially learn from what's already happened to ensure that their journey from startup to sort of growth stage is swifter and has lesser hurdles. The second bit here is about the need to develop platforms and networks that can represent national, regional, and global issues and offer relevant interventions. Now, we've seen in these past 10 years, and yeah, I led Sankalp Forum as one of the very early stage platforms that started focusing on social entrepreneurship and impact investing. And it was interesting that at the time we started, we were still largely about creating a definition of what social investments are all about, right? At that point back in 2008, we were still talking about, not having enough clarity between what commercial money can do in the space, or where can people move from grant funding to next. And I think while we were the first platform, what has been encouraging is to see that that today, 10 years hence, we're seeing several platforms. Every large city, even tier 2 cities, are hosting meetups or having, their own startup networks. There are angel investment networks. There are, places where entrepreneurs and small businesses can sort of come together and talk about their challenges and the opportunities to collaborate. What we still where we still need a lot more work is to develop an entire plethora of such platforms and networks that can represent not just the local issues, but issues and collaborative opportunities at the national, regional level, as well as at the global level. Because oftentimes what we also see is, when you look at a country like India or developing countries like India, you don't see their representation of the work that's happening in these countries at a global stage, or you don't see enough of what you need to see there. We also need to create this environment that these platforms and networks can work better amongst themselves, which means that they have to be open to greater collaborations, they have to be open to sharing pipelines, they have to be open to creating shared resources of funding, of funders and investors, and shared resources that entrepreneurs and social sector leaders can access. The third point here that I wanted to highlight is the need for a better regulatory environment and actually creating incentives for greater fund flow. Unfortunately, for a country like India, where the social sector, a large part of the social sector is still in this sort of area of gray, it's either you're non-profit or you're for profit, but it's hard to define how you call yourself, how you can be a social enterprise, or how you can be a for-profit enterprise doing social good as well. So we do need a lot more work still to actually create advocacy channels, to create regulatory mechanisms and environment that actually recognizes the need for interventions, both non-profit, both philanthropic, as well as commercial and market-based interventions that can support social issues. Because the scale of the social problems is such that you cannot do that by non-profit alone or for-profit alone. So you do need a greater overlap between the two segments happening if one needs to really tackle social issues more effectively. And one needs the private sector and the public sector to come together more effectively. A related piece here is the fact that there aren't enough incentives for fund flow. So currently, when we do see funding coming in the form of venture capital or private equity, a large part of this is still largely foreign. The source or the emergence is still largely foreign capital, and we don't see enough unlocking of capital from in country itself because there aren't tax breaks, because there are no incentives that actually push or that encourage an individual or a family office or a commercial investor to place their investments or to support for them to support the social sector. Yes, we have a CSR law now, but even the CSR Act is only mandated at 2%, can be highly restrictive in terms of what it can fund and what it can't. And unfortunately, a lot of those defining boundaries are difficult to maintain when you're working in the social space, where work often goes beyond a standard definition of work or a standard sort of model of operation. And the last, obviously, and we've talked a bit about this already, is the collaboration piece, that there is a need for greater collaboration and there is a need for the funding landscape itself to include collaborations as a key mechanism, almost as a key driver that needs to be there when any funding is released, of how that funding will encourage collaboration. It's not just a straitjacketed grant, but how can how can you create enough avenues for or encourage or incentivize collaboration to happen between nonprofits, between nonprofit and social enterprises, or between groups of investors and funders who are looking at the impact space. We're gonna spend some more time on unlocking funding from new and traditional sources. Just a second. Okay, so I've talked about, here I'm going to focus on, the need, and again, just going with the topic of this webinar, ways to unlock new funding. And, I've broadly clubbed these into 4 sort of big pieces, though obviously it's a very large sector. We're seeing an emergence of various different kind of funding approaches. But if you're a social entrepreneur or a nonprofit or an actor in the social sector, there are sort of 4 key areas that you would fall in, and this is where we're seeing that each of these, again, has a lot of innovation going within themselves. So the first I'm going to focus on is the sector-defining funds. Now, sector-defining funds are essentially, could be impact funds, could be debt funds, could be funds that actually start building a sector itself. The way the microfinance sector emerged in the 80s and the 90s, and the kind of funding infrastructure that emerged behind supporting the microfinance space. We are similarly seeing an emergence of such funds that are coming in. And here again, I think what's changing is not just that these funds are looking at social initiatives more and more carefully, but what we're seeing is how they are actually unlocking capital from not just from the traditional sources, which used to be the government and large foundations, usually large donor foundations abroad. But what we're actually seeing is that they're starting to unlock more and more capital from very new sources. In certain cases, we've seen a range of funds that are now coming or have emerged in the last few years that are actually raising money from the individuals, that are actually raising money from banks or corporates or family offices to set them aside for investing in very specific sectors or in very specific subsectors, generating either returns or creating very scalable social models that are encouraging further and newer sources of capital to come in. The second point here is around, the second source here is the clubs, networks, and investor donor platform. And here again, we are seeing a huge number of new donor platforms come up. This is so we've seen new angel investors coming in. What we are also seeing is the emergence of impact investment networks, which weren't there 8 years ago. You didn't have any impact investing network, and now there are actually practically every angel investing group or network has an impact track or a group of investors that are really keen to play a significant role in emerging markets. The establishment of such global networks has helped address the inefficiencies that were earlier there when traditional grant funding used to come in. We've also seen a greater degree of sharing of information and experience sharing between peers or between the actors that are active, or the donors and the investors that are active in these networks. What this does, obviously, is accelerate the development and implementation of several new initiatives, not just a standard sort of enterprise that's manufacturing products or that is offering traditional services. What we're seeing is that several of them have started actually asking about greater collaboration, bringing their portfolio of investees or portfolio of grantees together and have started encouraging greater collaboration, sharing of metrics, and so on. Here, the third bit, the third point here is on the innovative financial products for social funding and investments. And this here again is it has been a very interesting emerging field where we've seen new products like debt products, so debt which was otherwise loans or debt which were otherwise the mainstay of banks till a few years ago. We've now seen the emergence of venture debt funds. We've now seen the emergence of funds that are or financial agencies that are providing guarantees. And these kind of innovative financial products are enabling the social entrepreneurs and enabling the social sector to look at how they're designing programs and interventions in not just a model where they would create a proposal and almost give an expense statement and say this is how we plan to spend and use the grant, but they're actually starting to now think about ways to leverage their successes to create to use them towards seeking guarantees. They've been able to find debt sources based on their monthly cash flow that's coming in to and not just find equity very early on, but actually use working capital loans and so on. So we're seeing this whole new sort of spectrum of innovative financial products that are coming up now. That is being specially designed for the social funding and social investment space. The fourth point here is around catalytic financing structures. And these, again, quite a few of these need to have the risk-taking abilities, which the traditional grant-making model or the traditional venture capital and PE model did not necessarily have, because a lot of them in early days wouldn't touch something that's too risky, wouldn't actually invest because you didn't have a track record in a particular sector to fund. So what we're seeing is that there are actually newer mechanisms coming in that can take more risks than what we have seen in the past. And then I'm moving on to my next slide, which is around funding mechanisms and the need for greater innovation. So what we've seen is that the traditional funding mechanisms like grants, loans, equity investments are from the past days. They're still there. They're still very important. They're still they still take the large share of the pie. But we are seeing the need for an emergence of newer mechanisms. Crowdfunding has emerged in a big way. Guarantees is something that's increasingly being used by a lot of social enterprises. We see a number of pay-for-results mechanisms. These include the social impact bonds and development impact bonds. Even within the grants and investment segment, we're seeing an emergence of not just the traditional funders, like I said earlier, but individuals and the smaller philanthropists who would probably earlier make a donation once in a while to now actually use newer mechanisms to give out grants, to ask for more accountability, to be able to work in a more accountable fashion with the initiatives that they are supporting. Investments, again, we are seeing an entire cadre of angel investors and startup funders that's actually coming in, not just with the purpose of making money from those segments, but actually because they truly believe in a certain entrepreneur or in a new emerging innovative model that's coming up in the space. So we are actually seeing a lot of interest that is changing the way the funding landscape is in the social sector, largely because of the sources of those funding, but also because we're seeing an influx of talent and a connect with the specific social issues that is happening. One of the other bits that I hadn't talked about earlier is this emergence of venture philanthropy. Now there are networks of venture philanthropists around the world, but here again we're seeing that this is not a traditional philanthropist who would give just a simple grant and ask for the report at the end of the year. But here you're actually seeing philanthropists who are willing to actually put money almost as an investor into a venture, both for profit or even non-profit, but also get involved in the venture itself. So they do bring the capital plus approach of actually becoming a mentor to the enterprise or to the initiative and actually working directly with them. So I'll stop there, and we can talk a little bit more in detail based on the questions we have received towards what kind of funding mechanisms, what has worked for some of the participants on this webinar, what hasn't worked for some of them. And I'm just going to conclude with my last slide here, which is about looking into the future. And I think, the interesting bit here is that I think the future of funding, while we've seen a huge change in the past decade, in the past 10 years, I believe the future of funding is going to look extremely different and very different and very interesting, innovative 10 years from now. Now, I think there are 6 key drivers here that each of the social sector players need to take into account, and especially for those of you on this webinar who are actually the implementers, either social entrepreneurs or if you're running your own NGO or working in one. I think these 6 points are something that you need to sort of pay special attention to. So the first of this is that increasingly funding is becoming more contextual, is becoming more local. And the trend that I see is that the more the funding we see coming to the space, the more it wants to be to address the local context. They want to understand if the funding, a funder wants to know if the funding is actually fitting well into the context that they will be supporting. If it is foreign funding, the foreign funder wants to see local funders matching the funding that they're bringing in. They want to see the support that you get as an enterprise or as an initiative from your local sources. So there is going to be an increasing trend of funding becoming extremely contextual, becoming extremely pointed in what it wants to achieve, and increasingly local in nature. The second related point is partnering with local funders. Increasingly, funders seek that you have local funders on board, that you just don't look at a funder sitting 10,000 miles apart, 10,000 miles away to fund you, but you actually find ways to partner with the government, with the local agencies, or with local funders that are in the region or have aligned interest. The third big area that we've seen, that I believe is already showing big signs of change, is funders willing to move beyond project and program funding. So in the past, I remember when I started my career, most of the funding that we used to pitch for or receive into initiatives that we would support was programmatic funding, which had a very standard sort of way of, the donor had strict guidelines about not more than say 15 or 20% for administrative costs or organizational development, not more, 80% needs to go into implementation, or 50% needs to go in implementation. It could be different things for different funders. But the point being that there was a huge amount of clamp down on what you could potentially use funding for. And for projects or for initiatives that were highly scalable in nature, they ran into problems of actually not finding enough capital to support themselves beyond the project and programmatic funding. What about organizational growth? What about innovation? What about bringing in new talent? What about taking big bets into the future? And I think that's what has started to change quite significantly. We are actually seeing more and more funders waking up to the fact that funding needs to move beyond project and program funding. It needs to support organizational development. It needs to support, it needs to be more flexible in nature. This again related to the fifth point further down in this list, but that it needs, funding can't just be about project and program funding. We are seeing an emergence of people or funders who are willing to look at innovation as well, who are willing to look at extremely high-risk models of tackling development, who are willing to invest or support platforms that have that do not have a proven model of work. The fourth is around embracing disruption. So we see that organizations, social sector organizations, are increasingly disrupting the way they were working. They're embracing disruption, and I think as an organization, if you are still following the model of operation or growth that you were doing 20 years ago, it's probably time to look at disruption quite seriously, because the sources of funding that are the new sources of funding that are now coming in are willing to look at disruptive models of change, are willing to look at what you could do to make your, say, social sector initiative more be more effective, or be more accountable, or be more transparent. How are you using technology to actually deliver your initiatives better? How are you creating better impact? How are you actually using your data to define what you would do tomorrow? How are you using your existing data to define your strategies for tomorrow, and so on? So there is a huge need to actually look at embracing disruption, and both from a implementer or a social sector initiative angle, but also that is what funders are seeking, and funders who are actually coming in the sector because they believe that funding could actually do that. Fifth, obviously, the flexible funding side, which is looking beyond project program funding, but also looking at new markets, looking at supporting pre-revenue organizations, looking at supporting high-risk models in also of social intervention. And finally, investments into shared learning. We're seeing an emergence of a cadre of funders that no longer wants to fund the enterprise or the social sector NGO. We're seeing an emergence of funders that want to come together because they want to fund creating creation of platforms, that they want to create newer, they want to create in a way labs and simulated environments of collaboration and growth, right? They do not want to be supporting 10 organizations. They want to build that platform that can support 100 today and 1,000 tomorrow. So we're seeing a trend moving towards that. And we're seeing some of the more smarter social sector initiatives actually starting to come together, starting to look at not just the standard, let me create a project and work with the community and deliver certain outcomes, but are starting to think about how they can actually bring like-minded partners together and actually create a platform that could last beyond the life cycle of an organization. And I think that, again, is going to be a very interesting trend into if more social sector interventions want to look at newer sources of funding going into the future. So with that, I'm going to just stop and see and hand over to the to our moderator, and we can tackle questions.
Thank you so much, Aparajita. I think this is really, really helpful for all of us. I'll request all the participants to take about 30 seconds and post their questions in the Q&A section on your tab, or you can put it in the chat window. Aparajita, you may be able to see that people have already put in some questions in the Q&A section, and you can start.
Is this an open tab, right, on the...
Yes, that's right.
Yes, sorry, just looking at this. So I see the first one, which is from Remya Sasendran. She's asked, responding to proposals usually requires experienced professionals and requires resources in terms of time and skills. How can small community-based organizations that may not have these resources compete with larger organizations for the same funding pool? Quite interesting. Okay, so Sorry, just a quick question for the moderator here. Do I need to type the answer, or I can just?
You can just share it. You can just share
Okay.
a Pratibha for everybody's knowledge. Yeah.
And can all the participants see the questions?
No.
Okay. Okay. All right. So Remya, to answer your question, I would say that one of so the first point that I'd like to make is that I think you, as a social sector or as a community-based organization, you need to look at a much more diversified pool of funding that goes beyond the standard, proposal requests for proposals that you see, because there are fewer and fewer of those coming through. Especially in the last 2 to 3 years, we're actually seeing lesser and lesser number of these coming in, and when they do come in, they have got a very small sort of pool of capital to invest or fund, which means that as a community-based organization, you probably need to go beyond looking at these sort of traditional RFPs and need to look at more innovative mechanisms to how you could raise funds. But to answer your question more directly, one of the things that you could do as a small community-based organization is to actually have people who could actually come on board for very specific purposes, like this one, where you are looking at creating a proposal, but you do not have a full-time proposal writer on role. Could you potentially bring in somebody who comes in with a strong experience in the proposal writing sphere, or comes in with that vintage, but can give you a certain number of days on a fee or volunteer with you to actually help you create those. The other is to look at, to potentially look at bringing in, better training resources or online training for your existing staff, so that they can be better trained on how to actually respond to writing proposals. But again, I think the crux of the matter is that the funding pool is shrinking. And you do need to actually go beyond that to see if you have opportunities to use newer innovative mechanisms. It could start with even something like crowdfunding. Could you build campaigns that allow you to actually bring in increased sources of funding? Could you actually work with a certain number of other CBOs who are like-minded or who are trying to do the same thing to actually create larger projects? Because if you have a larger project, it potentially gives you the opportunity to pitch for larger pools of funding by bringing in more synergies together. So I'll stop at that. And if you still have questions, you can always, I think, post it to ISDM and they can forward it to me. Okay, second question is an anonymous attendee who's asked how to develop an impact bonds work. I think that's content enough for one full webinar itself. But in short, development impact bonds are essentially mechanisms which are about paying for results. So they are not traditionally, technically they are not bonds. They're not listed anywhere. They are a commitment that once an intervention or impact is delivered, the funder will pay for it. So in any impact bond, there are 4 actors. One is the implementing organization. Now let's take the example, let's call it NGO A. NGO A is trying to do a health intervention or education intervention that allows them to actually deliver a certain level of impact on ground. In order for them to do their project well, they need that initial pool of capital. Now that comes from the second stakeholder called the risk investor. The risk investor actually brings in that initial capital, almost taking a bet, taking that risk that the intervention might succeed or may not succeed, assuming that the NGO in question or the social enterprise in question will deliver their services well. Then we have your third stakeholder who comes in, which is a third-party intermediary. Usually, this is a person or an organization that's going to verify whether outcomes have been met. Now, assume this is the case of education indicators. Then, at the end of, say, the school year, you have a project that's delivered to actually better the quality of education and to achieve certain number of impact in, say, literacy and numeracy. If these outcomes have been met, the risk investor has put in the initial capital required to required to get the project launched and started. The third stakeholder, which is the intermediary, comes in and says, well, I'm going to verify if the outcomes have been met. Now, if the outcomes have been met, that's when the fourth stakeholder comes in. The fourth stakeholder is the philanthropy, or what is called the philanthropic pool of capital in a social impact bond, that is usually the government. So this is the donor agency that comes in, or the philanthropic pool of capital that comes in to replace the money that the risk investor has come in. So at the end of an impact bond, what you have is services delivered in a better manner with verifiable impact that have got the initial money from a risk investor to implement. But once their impact has been proven and all the leakage is covered and ensured that the outcomes have been successfully met, that's when the government or the private sector donor actually pays for the outcomes having been met. So all in all, it's a financial intermediation tool. It's not something I would say one should idly look at. If you're an NGO, don't look at it as a source of funding, but look at it as a way to bring better outcomes, or more measurable outcomes in the work that you do. Again, I'm happy to point to very specific sources of development, to specific sources online that can actually give you a quick and easy mechanism to understand how DIPs work, how development impact bonds and social impact bonds work. I'll move to the third question, which is about what kind of skill set and experience is important for a career in impact financing. That's a good one. So technically, you need to have a lot of common sense and the ability to actually learn new challenges and learn new ways of work. Honestly, I don't believe, and I'm not sure I'm going to be very popular with ISDM for saying it, you do not need a degree or a diploma in development to actually do this, right? You could come in from, and I say this from the experience of having hired people from all kinds of background, people coming in from corporate sectors because they want to give back, or because they think that they can use their skill sets in the social space. But if you're very specifically looking at impact financing, the interest and the ability to actually pick up basic financing understanding of how investing works, that's a good enough starting point. And beyond that, you could be coming from liberal arts background, or you could be a social worker. There is actually nothing that's defining there. And I think that's the beauty of the sector, that one of the reasons why it's so rich and so dynamic and so innovative is because we have people coming in from marketing, from liberal arts, from politics, from commercial space, from banking, financial services, and so on, and actually coming and making it an extremely vibrant space to work. So technically, I mean, just to respond to your question in a nutshell, you don't need any specialized skill sets or experience to work in the impact financing space, as long as you have the willingness to learn it on the job, because there is enough and more opportunity to pick that up. Now, going on to Pradeep Chakrabarti's question here, what is the trend of social investors investing in outcome-based funding? Has this started? And if yes, are there examples which have worked? Pradeep, yes, these have started. Outcome-based funding has been around now for over a decade, it's about 15 years or so. Around the world, there are somewhere between 35 to 40 active models of outcome-based funding that we've seen. These include social impact bonds, development impact bonds, various pay-for-results mechanisms that have worked. Now, where we are seeing actually changes happening is that what started off initially as social impact bonds, where the government would pay for the outcomes, we are starting to see smaller models or smaller prototypes, I would say, of impact bonds or outcome-based funding happening, where investors, risk investors, and philanthropists are coming together to actually create or support a project or outcomes that can be verifiable, that can be more accountable. We are seeing the desire from more and more social investors to come and invest into this. The models are usually I mean, the typical sort of social impact bond or a development impact bond can get fairly complicated in how it's structured. So what personally I've seen is that a large number of investors or new age sort of funders are demanding simpler models that could actually work for them in a smaller sort of context until the time they can perfect it, until the time they can actually see more verifiable impact, and then move to a place where they have a comfort level of investing into larger impact bonds or into sort of more syndicated deals. In terms of the examples that I've worked at, quite a few. I had the privilege of being part of a team at my last organization, British Asian Trust, where our team in London was creating the development impact bond in education. And this was in primary education. It got launched earlier this year and is already successfully under execution now. This was again based on the pilot that was done by with Educate Girls in these past 4 years, where we've seen good verifiable indicators and reports on ground data that has emerged that has said that yes, the impact bond has been a success. Yes, we've seen learning outcomes actually being more measurable, more impactful. We've seen a greater degree of accountability and transparency in the way funding has been used. So that's the one I'll quote right now because that's very contextual. It's in India, but otherwise, there is an entire anthology of there's a publication which I am happy to share the name of after this webinar with ISDM, and they can share it with all the participants, which actually lists all the outcome-based financing structures that we've seen around the world. So you can use that to further your knowledge. The next question I see here is from Anuradha Roy Chaudhary. She says, I'm from a small NGO that works with few beneficiaries but completely transforms their lives. We find it difficult to win competitive grants because everyone wants scale. How do we tackle this? Anuradha, it's an interesting position to be in. What I would suggest, and I mean, again, various mechanisms work for different people, but what I would suggest is two things. One, look at your local corporates. Look at how you could actually build relationship with the organizations or companies that are mandated to put their local CSR monies into the region, because a lot of them may not necessarily seek scale, but may seek opportunities such as employee intervention, employee volunteering opportunities, or are open to supporting you because they share your vision of deep impact with the few beneficiaries that you have on board. The other is to look at other sources of funding, beyond the competitive grants. So one of those is looking at crowdfunding models. Can you do campaigns that allow you to bring in local stakeholders and run a crowdfunding campaign online that actually your beneficiary group can actually help spread the word about, and hence get you more support from friends and family, and the second and third degree connects from there. The second could be potentially looking at camps and models that allow you to talk about your work and hence raise money from it, because people can directly connect to what you're doing. So I would strongly recommend looking at opportunities beyond competitive grants, because again, as a small NGO, you may not have the resources to justify for the kind of work you need to put in each and every proposal that's going out. So I'll stop there. I think those are the questions I see right now.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, great. Aparajita, is there anything, last few words that you'd like to share with the participants before we close out?
I think no, nothing in particular content-wise, but I think just I wanted to say thank you to all the participants who were with us on this webinar, also very specifically to ISDM to host this and to give me and the participants an opportunity to interact virtually. I would definitely like to share a few resources for the participants. I believe it'll be great to know if I could send them to ISDM, and when you do a recap of maybe this webinar, we could
Yes.
do that. And I think that's it. My coordinates are with ISDM, and he's the found on LinkedIn. So I'd be happy to carry on offline conversations with the participants who we may not have been able to answer questions for. Thank you once again, and it was a pleasure to be on this.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much, Aparajita, for doing this for us. And thank you to all the participants for engaging with us through this webinar. And we're hoping to continue these conversations offline through emails and other platforms. So once again, thank you all and good evening.
Thank you.